Hey, what's up? Welcome to After Effects Basic Training. In this series, I'm going to show you how to use After Effects, and hopefully we'll get the basics out of the way so that you can move on to some more advanced things. Some of you are here because you want to learn After Effects. For others, maybe you lied on your job application or your resume and you said you knew After Effects, so now you're scouring the web for some ways to actually learn it, and you found this great resource. Well, either way, I'm glad you're here, and let's go ahead and dive right into it. So, this is After Effects, and if you've made it this far, that's great. It means you got past the tip of the day. So good work, and let's go ahead and move on. First thing we have here is the project window. This is where our media, all of our files, our compositions are all going to be stored. So let's go ahead and import some files now. So I'm going to choose File, Import, File. Now I can do this another way. I can double click in the blank area of the project window. So I'll do that now, and the import dialog pops up. Now we can import any kind of media file for the most part, and we can do that by selecting it and choosing Open. We can also select multiple items at once and choose Open. We can also hold down Control and select specific files, or Shift and select a range of files. You can also go back, hold down Control, and unselect certain files. So it pretty much works like most operating systems, but I want you to know that most of that translates inside of After Effects. Another thing we can do is go outside of the folder and select the folder and choose Import Folder. And this will bring in all of the media items in that folder that are acceptable to bring into After Effects. So now we have a folder inside of our project that has all of our footage. Now we can make another folder by clicking on this folder item, and we can call it Images. Then if we move this Images folder outside of the footage folder, we can then move our cloud JPEG into that folder. So now we've organized our items into subfolders, and this is a good idea for keeping your project organized so you can find things, etc. We can also rename the items in the project window. For example, I can click on this girl.mov, hit the return key on the main keyboard, and type mall video. Now, this doesn't actually rename the actual file, but it does rename it inside of After Effects so you can reference it. Now, when you select an item in your project window, the information shows up in your project panel. We can also right-click, choose Interpret Footage, Main. Now, this is basically like your item properties or your footage properties. We can click on that, and this brings up a dialog that allows us to do a few things. For example, we can conform the frame rate to another frame rate. Say we know it's a different frame rate and After Effects just isn't recognizing it for some reason. We can change it here by just typing it in. We can also play with the field options, or if you're working with 24p advanced footage, there are many options here to change that as needed. We can also change the aspect ratio of the pixels. Color management options are also available, but we probably won't get into that for now. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. And let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other items available when you right-click on your footage. We have our replace footage. Now, say we have an updated version of this same shot that's exactly the same length, and we've already used it in our project. Well, we can replace it, and it will then replace all of the instances of it in the project. Pretty helpful. We can also reload the footage. For example, if our footage is an image sequence out of, say, a 3D application, we made an update to it, we can then reload it here. We can also reveal in Windows Explorer, and this will bring up the actual location of that file. Now, I know what you're thinking, this is basic training and it's going to be boring, but I got to tell you, it's going to be even more boring than you probably imagine. So I'm sorry about that, but there's just nothing you can do about that. These basics, you just got to get it out of the way. Let's go ahead and get started with a composition. So we've imported our media, but what exactly do we do with the media? Well, we need to put it into a composition. So what we need to do is create a new composition. So from the composition menu, new composition, Control N, I'm going to click that, and then we have this composition dialog that allows us to change the settings from any one of these settings or your own settings. You can also customize it as needed, and there's a few advanced options as well. For now, I'm going to use the NTSC DV preset, and we can also change the duration. Now, in a video editing application, the duration can be whatever you want it to be. You just keep adding files to the timeline. Well, in After Effects, it's set by the composition. Now, of course, you can go in and change this at any time, but if you know you're working on a 30-second commercial, make it 30 seconds. I'm going to choose OK. Now a new composition is created. We now have our comp monitor, and now we have our comp timeline. Now to add media to our composition, we can drag it from the project window and drop it into the composition. We can also drag it from the project directly to the timeline as well. Now before I move on, let's take a look at the user interface. Now I know what you're thinking. What is this guy looking at? Well, let's put that aside for a moment, and let's start with the time controls. Now in After Effects, most things do not play back in real time, but instead they RAM preview, or in other words, they render to the RAM to allow it to play back in real time. Now from the time control window, we can click on this RAM preview button, and it'll begin rendering, showing you here by the green, and when it's finished, it'll begin to play back. Now we can also set the work area. So if we grab this and drag it in, we can render just a specific region. And that's good because that way you can focus on any one part of your entire composition while you work. Now you can also change the frame rate of the playback, and I'll note that this doesn't change the composition, but just the playback. You can also skip frames in order to make the preview faster, although it will be slightly choppy. Now the resolution can be set to half or even a quarter, which will allow the RAM preview to be quicker. Sometimes when we're working, our animations don't have to be really high quality. We're just looking at the timing or the overall speed of the animation, and the resolution is nice to be able to adjust. Now, automatic will base itself on whatever the composition is set to. In this case, it's set to full, and that way it will render full. But if you're always working half, it will automatically render it back at half resolution. So pretty helpful. Now we have some other time controls here, but frankly I don't ever use them because if I want to look at something, I generally want to see it in real time. Now we do have our audio switch, and that will mute audio or allow audio to render as well. And then we have our playback. We can play it back to fourth, or play once, or continuously loop. So pretty helpful, and I recommend you use the 0 key on the number keypad to access your RAM preview. In that way you're going to be a fast keyboard shortcut kind of guy. Now other things to note in the composition is the zoom. We can change that. We can also roll the middle mouse button, and that will zoom in. You can also hold Alt down, and it will zoom in to wherever the mouse is. Up here to the top is our tool palette, and we also have our workspaces. We can always reset our workspace if they become, unmanageable. And the way the panels work in After Effects 7 and CS3, in which we're in now, is you can kind of move them around, stretch them out, give yourself more space. You can also hit the tilde key, which is the key just next to the number 1 on the main keyboard, and that will zoom into any panel that your mouse is over. And that's helpful for just pulling it up really quick, and then you can zoom in. If you hold down the space bar in the composition window, you can move it around and click and drag, and that way you can kind of, if you're in really close, you can hold down the space bar and move to an area that you want to focus on. And again, we can zoom out and reposition. So really helpful tips that I use a lot in my tutorials and while I'm working as well. Of course, at any time we can go into the composition settings and make adjustments. If we want to increase the size or change the duration, that's all available anytime you need it. Now another feature I have disabled because I am screen recording is the fast preview preferences. Now we can set this to off, wireframe, adaptive, or a couple of OpenGL options. What this does, if I had a very complicated composition, which I don't, but if I did, if I were scrubbing through this, the resolution would degrade itself to be able to play back relatively quickly. That's what adaptive resolution is all about. Basically, if I'm at full res and I scrub through this, it will go down to quarter res or half res, and able to keep up with me scrubbing through it. Now there's also OpenGL, which uses your video card to accelerate the previewing, but sometimes it can be inaccurate to a certain degree. So if something's not looking right, make sure you check adaptive resolution to see if that is the problem. Remember, not all video cards support all of the functions in After Effects. And one other of my favorite tips is if you set your work area, you can right click on it and choose Trim Comp to the work area. And that will cut the composition so that only that area is the length of the comp. So now we have a 1 second comp rather than a 30-second comp. So very helpful if you're just working on a single shot and you want to focus on it. Now, let's go ahead and move on to some effects. Welcome back to the effects portion of the After Effects Basic Training Series. Before I move on, I'm going to reset my project workspace. So I'm going to choose Reset Standard. And it's going to ask me, I'm going to discard changes, and that sets us back up where we left off. Now I'm going to actually make a new composition. And I'm going to take this mall video of this girl and drag it into this button. And this is the Make New Comp button. And what that's going to do is make a new composition with all of the same settings as the piece of footage. So the size of the composition, the frame rate, all going to be exactly what the footage is, including the length of the piece of footage. So that's helpful if you're working on shots and you want to quickly make a brand new comp. You don't even have to go to the new comp dialog. So in this composition, we're going to start playing around with effects and effects controls and see how After Effects handles adding filters. With the layer selected, I'm going to choose Effect, and we're going to go down to Blur and down to Fast Blur. Now a fast blur obviously is just a blur that allows us to blur our footage out. Now you'll notice it gets a little dark around the edges, and we have the Repeat Edge Pixel option. And you'll see this Effects Control panel popped up when I added the effect. Well, if you hit F3, that toggles that up or down. Now we can also add additional effects. So Effect, Color Correction, say Curves, and this allows us to adjust the brightness and contrast. Now the way the effects work are, if you move the fast blur after the curves adjustment, it will add itself afterwards. So as you can see, it does make a difference depending on the order of the effects. Now another way to add effects is using the Effects and Presets palette. What this allows you to do is find effects pretty quickly. So if I'm looking for a glow, I can type glow and our stylized glow filter pops up. Now to add this to our footage, we can drag it directly to the piece of footage or to the instance in the timeline. And what that will do is add it into the stack of effects. Now we can adjust the glow as needed. We can also shut effects off momentarily while we're working. And of course there's unlimited options for any one effect that we can change. For example, if we increase the glow threshold, it will only apply itself to the brightest pixels. So as you can see, her dress and the sky is the only thing that's really emitting the glow, where everything else is sort of staying unaffected. We can also delete effects by selecting them and hitting delete. We can also select effects and choose Edit Duplicate for multiple copies. Or if we're experimenting, we can duplicate it, shut one off, and play with it. And if we don't like it, delete it, and then just turn the other one back on. Now there's a whole nother set of effects, and those are the Generate effects. So with the layer selected, I'm going to choose Effect, Generate, and in here we have a whole bunch of different effects. So a ramp is basically a gradient, and the gradient can be adjusted as needed. You can click on the color palette to change the color, and even change the type of gradient to a radial ramp. This is good for making backgrounds and actually generating content in After Effects without any actual source footage. Now there's other effects such as Generate Lens Flare, and the lens flare, as you probably know, is sort of the light blowing out the lens effect. And there's a whole bunch of other effects that you can use inside of your project. Now, let me quickly show you a few common ones. First, color correction, hue, and saturation. This is a really good filter for colorizing your footage. So if I click on the colorize checkbox, everything now has a tint color of this sort of reddish brown. We can change the hue by clicking and dragging this parameter. We can also increase the saturation by clicking and dragging left to right. Now, say we want to go for a sepia look. Well, we can go to sort of an orangish yellow and bring the saturation down just a bit, and there we have it. We can also add this glow onto the clip, bring the threshold up a little bit, and increase the radius of the glow, and we've created sort of a cool look to our video. Now, another popular effect is the effect color correction change to color. And what this allows you to do is pick a color, like her shirt, and change it to another color, like blue. So, pretty powerful effect with a few options in the tolerance range to really refine how your selection is made. Now, of course, all of these effects are keyframeable or animatable. So we can add a blur that starts out at 0 and goes up to 50, or a brightness that starts really bright and comes back down. And that's what we're going to cover in the next segment on animation. Welcome back to the animation segment of the After Effects Basic Training series. What we're going to do is cover animation, keyframes, motion blur, and pretty much everything to do with that right now. First thing we'll do is create a new composition using this piece of footage. So what I'm going to do is drag it into the Make New Comp button, and it's going to create a new composition using all of the settings from that file. And with this composition, the first thing we want to focus on is the transformations for this layer. So we'll click on this arrow and we have our transform properties, and then if we click on that arrow we have all of our main transformations: anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Now the anchor point is this center point on our footage, and what that is basically the pivot point for the layer. So if I were to rotate, you see the rotation occurs around that point. Or if I scale in, we scale in to that point. Now we can change that point by clicking on this tool up here called the Pan Behind tool, and we can click and drag this to anywhere we want. And now if we rotate, the rotation occurs around that point instead. Of course, we have our position, scale, as I showed you earlier, rotation, and our opacity of the layer. Now, these are all animatable properties. Now, we can reset all of the transform properties by clicking here. Or if we right-click on any parameter, we can then reset it specifically using this dialog. Now, say I want to fade this clip in. Well, let's go back to our main arrow tool. And what we want to do is keyframe the opacity from 0 all the way up to 100 over the period of, say, 1 second. So to do that, what we want to do is start at 0 and turn the opacity down to 0. So I type 0, hit enter. Then if we click on the stopwatch, that sets a keyframe at that point in time. Then if we move forward to 1 second in time using the current time indicator, I can then bring the opacity up to 100%. Then if I play this back by hitting my RAM preview button, you see that our clip fades in over that one period of time. After Effects essentially interpolates that data across time. Now, this works for any parameter. So, say I want to get rid of this. Well, I can shut the stopwatch off, and those keyframes are then eliminated. Now, say I want to make a position keyframe. Well, click on the stopwatch, move forward a couple of frames, and move the layer. And you can see a motion path is then created. Then if I play this back or scrub through it, you can see that the layer animates. Well, what I can do if I zoom out here is I can right click and reset this, and then move to the beginning of this timeline and just move this layer off of the frame. Now if you hold down Shift, it'll stay moving left to right or up and down. And that's kind of nice if you're trying to keep things in a straight line. So I'm going to move it just out of the frame. And then you're going to see that this animates in. And if I play this back, hitting the RAM preview, we have a nice animation. Now I'm going to set the work area so that when I render, it only renders a small portion. Now I can bring this in by just grabbing it, or if I can hit the letter N on the keyboard, it'll set it to the end. Or if I hit the letter B, it'll set the beginning of the work area. But in this case, I want the work area to start at the very beginning. Now, the animation is a bit abrupt. It kind of comes and then it just stops instantly. Well, I can change that. If I select this keyframe, I can hit F9 on the keyboard, and it changes the kind of keyframe from a linear keyframe to a Bezier keyframe. And this Bezier keyframe allows this to kind of smooth in. It's called an easy ease keyframe. So now if I play this back, you can slightly see that it sort of slowly stops. And that's kind of what we want. Now we can also move the keyframes around if we want the animation to be longer or shorter. Now one thing that might be missing from this is motion blur. And motion blur is basically when something moves too quickly, it kind of blurs across the frame. Well, After Effects has built-in motion blur. Now to turn on the motion blur, every layer has a switch with a little ball bouncing. And that is the motion blur switch. So if we click that, that turns it on. Then for the composition, we can turn on the motion blur switch here, which enables it globally. Then if we play this back, you'll see our clip now has motion blur. Okay, and the motion blur works for most any of the transformation properties. So if we rotate it as well, turn on the stopwatch for rotation, move forward, I can then set a keyframe without even changing the parameter by just clicking in this little checkbox here. Then if I move back to the beginning, I can rotate this 50 degrees or so, play it back, and our layer now kind of flies in. We can also add our easy ease curve to this keyframe by hitting F9 as well. And that'll just make the animation a little bit smoother. Now, keyframes can be manipulated just as their parameters. And what we can do is we can copy keyframes. If we select a range of them, I can hit Edit Copy or Control Copy, and then Edit Paste. And then keyframes are then pasted again. Now, of course, they're going to interpolate in between each other. Now you can reverse the order of them by dragging it to the other side of a keyframe. And then if we move these closer together, what we've created is sort of a fly on and a fly off. We can also select a range of keyframes, and if you hold down Alt or Option on the Mac, we can drag the end of the range and sort of shrink or grow it with the values staying relative in the distance from each other. So you kind of see they kind of squish in or squish out. That's pretty helpful for speeding up animations or slowing them down. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and delete this by shutting off the stopwatch and hitting the reset for the transform. That takes us back to the default level. Now, here are some good shortcuts that I think you should know. If the layer is set at the default level like this, if you hit the letter S, scale comes up. If you hit the letter T, opacity, A, anchor point, R, rotation, and what am I missing? P for position. And the great thing about this is if you want to get directly to a specific parameter without using up all your screen space, you can use these shortcuts. Now, you can also hit scale by S, hold down Shift, hit P, that brings up the scale and the position. And then with Shift down again, hit R, and that way you can bring up any specific parameters that you want to affect. Now, like I said, this works with filters as well. So with the layer selected, I'm going to choose Effect, Blur, Fast Blur. And what I can do is turn the Fast Blur up, turn on the Repeat Edge Pixel to clear up the edges, set a keyframe for the blurriness. And remember, keyframes all matter on where the current time indicator is. So If you want the keyframe to be at the very beginning, make sure your current time indicator is at the very beginning. Click on the stopwatch, move forward, turn the value down to 0, and now we've created an animation where the blur kind of slowly fades out. Well, what if I want to bring up these parameters in the timeline? Well, we can toggle down to our effects, to our fast blur, and here it is, keyframes and all. But there's a lot of extra information that we may not need to look at. Well, we can close it, select the layer, and hit U. And what the U key does is brings up all of the properties that have keyframes applied to it. So if I were to bring up the opacity, holding down Shift and the letter T, I can turn the stopwatch on and fade it out just a little bit. Then if I were to collapse this and hit U again, those parameters would both come up because they have keyframes applied to them. Now, say I made an adjustment to my position. Holding down Shift and P, I brought the position up. I can adjust the position, but I'm not going to add a keyframe. And then I'll collapse this. I can hit the letter U, and that'll bring up all my keyframed values. Then if I hit U twice, this brings up all the parameters that have been changed from their default level. So the repeat edge pixels is usually off, but I turned it on, so it shows up. The position has been slightly offset, so it shows up as well. And that's nice for bringing up any edited parameters. Let's go ahead and delete all these for now. I'm going to reset the transform, delete our fast blur, and collapse the layer properties. Then I'm going to go back to my project window, and I'm going to take this cloud image and drag it out to our comp. Now let's talk about some more of the functions in the comp window. If I hit the tilde key, the key next to the number 1, I can then bring up a full screen mode that allows me to scale up layers. I can also take the rotation tool and rotate the layer directly in the monitor. Now if I go back to our main view, I want to show you a few things in the timeline. Now the way the timeline works is a stack. Basically anything on top shows up on top in the composition window. Now if I move this just out of the way, you'll notice that the layers are there. They're simply being hidden by anything that's on top. Now I can simply select the name, click it, and drag it beneath it, which allows you to move layers around. You can also toggle on this transparency switch. This allows you to see what is transparent in the background, so you're not confusing it with layers. Now in our timeline, we also have our eye switch, which turns layers on or off. We also have our solo switch, which will solo any one layer, or you can solo multiple layers if you have a large composition. A few other switches here. We have our 3D switch, which we'll get into a little bit later, and our parenting switch, which is a very powerful function. For example, if I take our cloud layer, put it on top, and say I just kind of stick it right here, this is obviously photorealistic compositing here, and what I can do is grab this pick whip and drag it to my Tino layer. And now if I take my Tino layer and move it around in the composition, you see that that layer kind of stays connected to it. And that's because it's acting as its child and doing whatever it does. Now we can undo that by just clicking on None. And of course we can add effects directly to layers, but we can also create an adjustment layer. And this is a special layer. So if I select Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, what this is going to do is create a layer on top of our composition, and now if I add a blur to that layer, the blur is going to affect everything beneath this layer. This is helpful. Say you want to add color correction to everything and you don't want to have to copy and paste it to every other layer. You can choose Effect, Color Correction, Curves, make your color adjustment, and it applies it to all of the layers beneath it. Now, we can also bring the opacity of the adjustment layer down. So if I hit T, I can turn the opacity down, which kind of lowers the intensity of this specific effect. We can also turn the fast blur on and move the adjustment layer beneath the layer. So now it only affects this layer, not the layer of the clouds, which is above it. So if you have a bunch of layers, you can just put the adjustment layer over the layers you want to affect. Now, it will affect everything beneath it, and that's sort of the way it is. You can also create layers yourself in After Effects without using any footage by choosing Layer, New, Solid. And the solid settings allow you to make backgrounds. So say I want to make a red background, choose OK, choose OK. It adds it to my project. I can drag this to the background, and now I have a nice red background that I can, add titles to, or make a video screen that has a bunch of smaller videos on it. Pretty good. I mean, this is like NBC style graphics here. Okay, well that's it for the animation segment. Check out the keying and transparency segment for a little bit more advanced compositing tricks. Hi, welcome to the keying and transparency section of the After Effects Basic Training Series. What I have here is a blank composition with this piece of footage of our action star pretending like he gets, shot or blown up. And what we can do is key out the green and put something else behind him. Now, of course, an effect like this could take hours, but I'm just going to kind of quickly run through the basics. So with the layer selected, I'm going to choose Effect, Keying, Key Light. And this is After Effects Keying plugin for green and blue screens. And what you do is use the screen color to click on the green. And that gets rid of most of the green. We can turn on this toggle transparency switch. Now we see we have a bunch of stuff in here that shouldn't be. And we can go down to the screen matte options and just increase the clip black and decrease this. We can also increase the gain a little bit. Anyway, you can actually check out a more advanced tutorial on this at videocopilot.net, but as you can see, this plugin will key out green or blue. Now, we do have another problem, is this stuff in the background. So to get rid of that, we're going to use a mask. And a mask is basically a cookie cutter. So if I shut off the Key Light plugin for a second, I'm going to come up to our tool palette. I'm going to take the pen tool, and I'm just going to draw a shape. And as you can see, when I close that shape, everything outside of it gets cut off. And this is called a mask. Now, if I toggle down the layer properties, we now have a mask added. And we can look at it, and there are a few properties to this mask. Now, first of all, there is the mask path, and that is the shape that we can then adjust and move around. We also have feathering, which can be increased to soften the edges of the selection. This doesn't necessarily have to be used with green screen. You can use this to make a photo montage or a video montage and soften the edges of your pictures. Just try to think of the possibilities with these masks. There's also the opacity and the expansion. So the expansion will kind of grow the bounds or shrink them if you would like that. Now, these parameters have a stopwatch, which means they are keyframeable. So I could set the keyframe for the mask path, move forward a bit, and take the selection tool and just adjust these mask points. Then if I play this back, you can see those points kind of adjust. So kind of a helpful thing that I'm sure you will use in the future. But for now, I'm going to select the mask and hit delete. Now, what I want to use the mask for is to get rid of some of this background stuff and our helper right here on the side. So if I turn key light back on, I can take the pen tool and click around the edges and basically draw a shape around what we don't want to include in the shot. This is also called a garbage mask, and that basically cuts out everything that's not inside of this shape. Now, taking out the background is the first part of a shot like this. Now, we want to add something to the background. So if I go to my project window, go down to my Action Movie Essentials collection, and this is a collection of action stock footage that you can find at videocopilot.net, one of our products. And inside of here are some explosions. And we can take one of these explosions, say the explosion 1, and drag it underneath this Tino movie. And if we go to right here when he gets blown up, we can then line this explosion up, scale it up, and so we've sort of created a basic composite of this explosion. Now, of course, we would want to finesse this and make it more impactful, but you get the basic idea of compositing. You have layers on top of other layers, and some of them have transparency, some of them don't. Other things I want to talk about is transparency. Here's our footage of our action star. Now, I'm going to go into another one of our products called Riot Gear. And Riot Gear is sort of organic stock footage, paint effects, and ink and things. And I'm going to go into our paint splatter effects. And I'm going to take our first paint splatter and just drag it out to our comp. And as you can see, it's basically paint kind of thrown onto the screen. And you can see the background is black and the inside is white. Now, before we get into that, I want to talk about transfer modes. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, you're probably familiar with transfer modes. And transfer modes are basically different ways to blend with the layers beneath it. Now, if you hit F4 on the keyboard, that brings up the transfer modes. You can also click on the toggle switches button, and that'll bring up these if they're not already up. Now, we can change the transfer mode to multiply. And what that does is basically shows through anything that is white. Or you can change it to screen, which does the opposite of that. So all the black sort of gets keyed out, and now we have just the white. I recommend you kind of go through them and play with them and kind of see what they do exactly. But that's one way you can actually composite in After Effects. Now, it works even better if you're using, say, a texture. So if I shut the paint off for a second, I can go into our texture collection from Riot Gear, and I can take one of these textures and drag it onto our clip. In this case, it's this wall. Well, if I change the transfer mode to multiply, you see we sort of added a texture over our movie and only the dark stuff is showing through. Or screen will kind of show just the brighter areas. Overlay sort of does a mixture of both of those. Okay, now let's talk about a real important function called the track matte function. You can see it right here. And what the track matte function allows you to do is add transparency to a layer that doesn't already have a transparent track. So in this case, everything is opaque. There, if I turn on the transparency switch, we don't see anything. Now, if I go into my Riot Gear effects, and let's go to my ink drops. And if I take my first ink drop and drag it out, you see this is basically a clip of ink being dropped into a fish tank, basically. And it's perfectly matted, so we have black in the background and white in the foreground. Now, what we can do with this Tino layer is set the track matte so that it uses this layer, the layer directly above it, as the transparency source. So, with the Tino layer selected, you hit F4, this brings up the track matte option. You can also toggle it like I showed you earlier. And what I can do is change the track matte from nothing to Luma Matte Drop 1. And what that does, if I turn on my transparency switch, is anything that is black is transparent and anything that is white shows through. Now, I can go into this drop layer, choose Effect, Color Correction, Curves, and I can brighten it, just blow it out really bright. See, like that? Then if I shut the layer off, you'll see that my footage beneath it shows through a lot clearer, and that's because semi-transparent stuff sort of see-through. Now, of course, I can scale this layer up as well, and that'll show through more of our character. I can also go to my Tino layer and invert the matte so that we sort of cut out everything but this layer. Now, for this shot, it's probably better if we use something else instead of this green screen footage. So I'm going to go to my images, and I'm going to replace the cloud footage with this Tino layer. Now, here's a great tip. If you select a layer in the timeline, you can replace it by grabbing something else, holding down Alt, and dropping it right on top of it. And you'll see it basically replaces it. That's a very helpful tip you're definitely going to find useful. So now you can see we've cut out the middle of this cloud layer, and we can then put footage underneath the cloud layer and kind of it shows through. So what we have is the clouds on top of this girl, and we're using this ink drop as sort of the transparency for it. Let's see, we could sort of frame this up even so that, you know, our girl's just looking just through the ink drop, or even rotate the ink drop so that she's right in the middle of it. So something to think about. Obviously, this is speculative training and not my favorite kind of training. I don't like to be telling you how things can be used. I prefer to show you actual real-world examples and show you how this tool is used to achieve a specific effect. But with basic training, I think the idea is to get an understanding of the program and just sort of see the possibilities, not so much actually, okay, I know how to use the program now, because experience is the key. And also, while you're watching this, you know, I recommend you think about other ways you can use these techniques. It's like, here is this filter, you know, what other ways can you use it for? So that's definitely something you want to be thinking about. For example, I just thought of something sort of an outside of the box thought that might come in handy. So what I'm going to do is take our Tino fall layer and drag it out again. So here's our green screen footage. And just as I did before, I'm going to key out the green. Keying, key light. Select the green, select the darker area, and just kind of make an adjustment to this. Then we're going to take the pen tool, and I'm going to cut out the outer stuff so that we just focus on our main character, just like we did before. And now what I'm going to do is use his video as a track mat for our clouds. So how am I going to do that? Well, take the cloud layer and put it underneath the Tino layer. So that's what it would look like normally. And I'll just delete these other layers for right now. So he's just walking out in front of the clouds. Pretty cool. But if I take the clouds and change the track mat to alpha matte, that's going to use this layer's alpha. And now that we've applied the keying to it, it has an alpha channel. It's not a luma channel, it's an alpha channel. So if we set it to a luma channel, you see we just get the highlighted areas that come in and the dark areas get cut out just like a normal track mat. But if you use the alpha mat or the alpha mat inverted, you can see we actually can kind of create a vignette of our character kind of walking out. And that's pretty interesting, especially if you're looking, that iPod look. You could make a new solid from the layer menu, make it black, or let's see, make it black, and make a new layer that is, purple. Put the purple layer in the background, put the black layer underneath the Tino layer, and set the black layer's track mat to alpha matte. And what that does is uses the Tino dancing around as a mat. And so now you see him doing his thing, and you sort of have that silhouette look. So that's what track mats are all about. It's all about transferring transparency from one source to another. And another final touch we could add is by creating a new black solid and choosing OK. What I can do is add a nice vignette around the edges. And what we'll do is take the ellipse tool and just draw a shape around the mask. So now we've created a circle around this black layer. Then if we subtract the mask, then we have sort of a black bounds. Then if we bring the mask properties up, I can feather the mask out. And then expand it inward or outward. In this case, we'll expand it outward. And so now we have sort of a nice soft edge around the outside of this file, and that looks pretty good. We have a little extra stuff here, and again, I'm just demonstrating things, but you can clean that up using some of the functions in the keying options. So, and hopefully this gives you sort of a foundation for transparency and working with keying inside of After Effects. Hi, welcome to the motion tracking segment of the After Effects Basic Training Series. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at motion tracking, but more importantly, we're going to learn what motion tracking is. So, to get started, I have some footage of Los Angeles, and I'm going to take it and drag it into the Make New Comp button, let it go, and a new composition is then created with all the same settings as my footage. Now, this shot is a little bit shaky. So what I want to do is stabilize it. But I don't want to stabilize the whole shot, just from about here to about here. So what I'm going to do is set my current time indicator about here, hit the letter B as in boy, and that brings the beginning of my work area to that point. I can also trim it by just dragging it. Then I'm going to move to about 4 seconds and hit the letter N. I can also drag the end of the work area as needed. Then I'm going to right click on this bar and choose Trim Comp to Work Area. And that will trim the composition to just that area of the clip. Now let's go ahead and get started motion tracking. So as you can see, this shot is a little bit shaky. So what we can do with motion tracking is get rid of that slight shake. And to do that, we can double click on our footage. And what that does is brings it up in a viewer. Now the composition looks like this, and the viewer looks like this. Now when you motion track in the viewer, not in the composition view. So if you want to motion track, you need to double click on your footage. So now that we have it up in the viewer, I'm going to choose Window, Tracker Controls. And here is the motion tracking controls. What we can do is stabilize motion or track motion. Now these two methods track the footage the same way. But the difference is how the data is used in the final video. Let's go ahead and start tracking this shot. So what we're going to do is stabilize the motion of this shot. So I'm going to click on Stabilize Motion. And what this does is creates a brand new track point. And what we can do with the track point is click on the inner square and move it around. Now a track point is made up of a few things. The inner square is the track area, which means what to search for from frame to frame. Now the outer area is the search area. So if you have a shaky shot, you want the search area to be large enough so that from one frame to the next, your track area can be found. Now if you make the search area too large, motion tracking can take a lot longer and be more inaccurate. So you want to make it as small as possible, but be able to search enough of the area to find that track point. Now, the track point works best on a high contrast area, like this corner. And as you can see, when you move it around, it sort of zooms in so you can see a little bit closer. So we want our track area to be on a high contrast point, such as this white corner. And the reason why is tracking analyzes frames to frames. Now, if we were to put this track area on these leaves, it would have a difficult time maintaining that track area because similar areas exist around it. So it might think that this is the area that's supposed to track instead of right here. So you want to have a distinct high contrast point such as this. Now let's find a suitable point to begin stabilizing this shot. So I'm rolling the mouse button out, and what I want to do is take my track point and drag it over here, and I'm holding down the space bar to drag in my comp since I don't have a lot of room to work. Now I'm going to move my first track point to the bottom of this gap sign. Seems like a pretty high contrast area. Then I'm going to zoom out. Now this shot also rotates slightly, so the tracker controls also have an option to analyze the rotation. And how this works is you create another track point. Now how this works is each track point analyzes the tracking area that you designate. And then depending on how much this point pivots from track point number 1, it creates a rotation value that is used to stabilize the footage. So what we want to do is find a track point that is kind of on the same plane as this building. So what I'm going to do is move my second track point up to the corner of one of these lights. And so now we've created this line from one point to the other. Now that we've set up our track points, we can begin to analyze the footage. And to do that, we're going to click on the Analyze Forward button. So as you can see, the data is processed and data has now been collected in the timeline. Now, we started tracking in the middle of the piece of footage. So what we need to do now is track backwards from this first point. And it's okay if the track overlaps, it'll just replace the track points with the new ones. So I'm going to click on the Analyze Backwards button, and that will finish tracking the shot from start to finish. Okay, now we've tracked the data, so what can we do with it? Well, we want to apply the data to the footage. So I'm going to click Apply, and it's going to ask X and Y, and we're going to choose OK. And now back in the main composition, the viewer sort of closes out momentarily and goes back to the composition. We can now scrub through our footage, and you can see by looking right here that the footage stays perfectly stable. Now, one side effect of motion tracking is that we get these black bars on the side. And the reason for that is that because the motion tracking data followed this one point on the gap sign, it moves the layer left and right in order to maintain that point, thereby stabilizing it. However, we get some black edges depending on how much the layer has to be offset in order for it to maintain that position. So the solution there, or the simple solution, is to simply scale the footage up. So with the layer selected, I hit the letter S, bringing up our scale option, and I'm just going to increase this to about 110. That gets rid of the black on the edge, and now we have a perfectly stable shot, and we can preview that through the time controls. Now let's take a look at another example. What I'm going to do is take the same Los Angeles footage, drag it into yet another composition. And we're going to go ahead and do a sign replacement on this Gap sign. So we received a letter from Gap. They're telling us to take the sign down. We're getting sued. Lawyers are coming to the house, throwing bricks through your window. So we want to go ahead and take care of this Gap sign. So what I want to do first is create a new solid. And what we're going to do is basically just black this out. So I'm going to take this color picker, and basically we're going to make a color solid that's the same color as this Gap sign. I'm going to choose OK. And so now we've created our layer. I'm going to just shut it off for a second. And what we want to do is double click on our Los Angeles movie, bring it up in the viewer so we can begin tracking it. So I'm going to double click. Here's our viewer. And remember, we're working in a brand new composition. And in this case, we're going to track motion, not stabilize. So I'm going to choose track motion. And for this, we're going to choose the track type perspective corner pin. And what this does is brings up 4 track points that are all kind of hooked together. And then what I'm going to do is line each of these track points up with this Gap sign. So I'm going to drag this one and line it up with the bottom corner. I'm going to drag this one, line it up with this bottom corner. That one. And that one. Now, one of the cool things about motion tracking is you do not have to track the point you're looking to calculate. For example, this track point number 4 is going to track this point right here, right in the middle of the track area. And as you can see, it's going to create the coordinate of about 600 by 400 if you look into my info palette here. Now, that's all fine, but what if this point was all black or somehow obscured, but just next to it was another point we could track? Well, in this case, we have this cross into the structure of the building. And what I can do is drag the track area to this cross. But the important thing is that our track point needs to be lined up with the Gap sign. So what I can do is drag the point, and you can see the mouse sort of changes into this point grabber, and I'm going to move it right over here. So our tracking is going to happen here, but the position data is going to be applied here. So it sort of offsets it automatically. Now, you want to be careful because if this was, say, on the other side of the building here, the tracking data wouldn't be perfect. So make sure it's on the same plane that you're trying to track. And also be aware that if we move the track point, it moves relative as well. Okay, so now that our points are set up, I'm going to begin to track the footage. So I'm going to click on the Analyze Forward button. And now you can see all 4 points have been tracked simultaneously. Now, the difference here is we don't want to apply this tracking data to our Los Angeles footage, but instead apply it to our dark lime green solid. So I'm going to click Edit Target and make sure that that layer is selected. And then I'm going to choose OK, and then we click Apply. And then it takes us back to our composition, and a bunch of tracking data and a corner pin effect has been applied to our dark lime green solid. Now, what we need to do is turn this layer back on, and you can see the lime green solid is now covering over the gap sign. And if I scrub through this, you can see that the sign is covered up by this dark lime green solid. Now we could add our own sign, but it might be a little tricky, but let's give it a shot. I'm going to select the layer, choose Layer, Pre-Compose. Now, for this type of shot, we want to leave all attributes in this comp, meaning this corner pin effect must remain in this comp, and then I'm going to choose OK. So now nothing's really changed, everything is the same, except now we can Alt double click on this dark lime green composition now that it's a comp, and reveal the layers inside. Now, the layer is back to its original size, and inside of this comp, it's basically squished down using the corner pin effect. Now, if I go back to our pre-comp, I could add text to this layer. So I'll take the text tool, click in the composition, and type VCP. And then I'll take the arrow tool, and we'll scale this up. And we want to scale it up to really stretch this particular document, just about like that. So now when I go back into my LA comp, you can see our VCP logo is on the wall and it's looking good. Now, we can also go back in here and scale this down as needed to make it look proper in here. We can also use an image to replace the sign as well. Now, back to the comp. As a final touch, you might add a slight fast blur to your text since video is usually a little bit softer than graphics. So I'll select the comp, choose Effect, Blur, Fast Blur, and we'll set it to maybe 1 or 2. Maybe 0.5. So that way it just looks a little bit more realistic. We can even add a glow, Effect, Stylize, Glow, and turn the glow intensity down to 0.5. So there you go, Video Copilot right on Hollywood Boulevard in LA. Now if I go back to my project window, I have a shot of Sam and Tino, and what I'm going to do is take this footage, drag it into the Make New Comp button. It's going to create a new composition, and then I'm going to double click on the footage in the composition, and this is going to allow me to motion track it. And what I want to do is motion track his ear. So I'm going to click on Track Motion. Our tracker point pops up, and I want to position this right on his ear. And then I'm going to click Analyze Forward. That's pretty good. So now I've tracked his ear. So what can I do with that? Well, let's take a look. First, this data is raw tracking data. We want to apply it to what's called a null object. Now, if I go back to my composition for a second, I can create that null object. So if I choose Layer, New, Null Object. Now, a null object just looks like this. It doesn't render, it's just a viewport helper. And it's also a layer that allows you to store information that you can use for other things. So if I go back to my Sam and Tino track layer, I can click Edit Target and choose that null object as the receiver for this tracking information. Then I choose OK and click Apply. X and Y, OK. Okay, now we're back in the composition, and now this null object has the tracking data applied to it. And so if I scrub through the video, you can see that null object is basically stuck to his ear. But the null object doesn't actually render, it's just there to help us. So what could we use the null object for? Well, what I'm going to do is create a new white solid. Choose OK, make it comp size, OK. Then I'm going to take the pen tool, and what I'm going to do is just create sort of a thinking box. And we can also click away and then click back on the mask and adjust the points if it's not perfect, because this is not perfect. And we can also click on the points and use the up and down arrow keys to move them. And I'm just clicking on one point, holding down Shift, and clicking on another point. And that way I can just kind of move the points and get the shape I want. And then I'm going to take this thinking box and just kind of move it near his head. And now I'm going to take the text tool, and just click inside of this box, and we're going to type "I'm lost" or something funny. You know, it's up to you. And now that we've created our thinking box, what I can do is take these two layers, hold down Shift, and select both of the layers. Then take the parenting pick whip and drag it to the null object. And now, if I watch this, you can see that layer is now connected to that track point because this null object follows that distinct point. Now, we can shut the null object off. We don't really need to see it. And at any time, we can adjust these layers and reposition it as we need. Maybe we can move this point down and move this up above him, and it will still follow along because it's linked to this null object. And that's the great thing about parenting. Now, we can also take this white solid, and this is the button to show or hide masks. We can shut them off since we want to kind of see what we're looking at. And I can choose Effect, Perspective, Drop Shadow. And then I can just kind of create a little shadow for our thought box here. So this, among other things, are great ways to use tracking data. Now, one other way we could use tracking data, I'm going to create a new black solid. And then I'm going to choose OK. And then I'm going to choose Effect, Generate, Lens Flare, our favorite lens flare. So here's a great lens flare. And what I'm going to do is hit F4, and I'm going to change the transfer mode to screen. So now we have our lens flare here. And I'm going to go ahead and just shut off these two layers for a second. And now what if we want the lens flare center point? So see how we can move the center point here? What if I want the lens flare to follow that point? So say instead of tracking his ear, we tracked, a light or something like that. We want to have a lens flare connected to it. Well, the way to do it is select the null object and hit the letter P. And that brings up the position. Then select this layer, bring down the effects, bring up the lens flare, and now we have our flare center. Now, the easiest way to do this is to alt-click on the stopwatch for the flare center. That brings up all this crazy stuff, but don't worry, just take this pick whip and link it to the position of the null object. And what that is going to do is always make sure that this data is the same as this null object. So watch this. Now, I don't know why you'd want someone's head to be glowing, but if you did, then this tutorial is right up your alley. But in this case, you can see the idea. Now, if for some reason you don't want to use this pick whip expression, you can alt-click on the stopwatch and that removes it. You can also select the parameter position, choose Edit Copy, select the flare center. This is where we want to paste this data. Choose Edit Paste, and that actually copies the actual keyframes from this layer to this layer, so you don't have to use an expression. But I think expressions are useful and a lot faster. Well, I hope you found this tutorial useful, and just be careful. If you really have a friend out there that has a lens flare coming from his face, you might want to think about who you've been hanging out with. And thanks for watching. Hi, welcome to the time remapping section of this After Effects basic training series. What we're going to do is take a look at speed changes inside of After Effects. Now, again, we have this clip of our action star kind of jumping back. And what we want to do, for example, is slow the clip down 50%. So to do that, we'll select the layer, right-click, choose Time Stretch. And we get a dialog that allows us to stretch the footage. Now we can stretch it 200%, which means twice as long as the original, or 50%, which would be twice as fast or half as long. So depending on the way you look at it, most video editors does this reverse, so it is important to kind of understand the way it actually works in After Effects. So in this case, we'll set it to 200% or twice as long as it normally is. So now we can preview this in slow motion. Okay, so as you can see, it's half the speed. Now, when you slow clips down in After Effects, basically what's happening is every other frame is duplicated twice. So if I hit page up and page down, I can cycle through the frames. Now you'll notice the current time indicator will change, but the frame doesn't change. And that's simply because every frame is being duplicated in order to make it twice as long. Now, there's other ways to process speed changes. The first way is to blend the frames together. And that way you have frame 1, you have frame 2, and in between frame 1 and frame 2 is frame 1 and frame 2 blended together at 50% opacity or so. And what we want to do is turn on this frame blending switch, and you can see we sort of have a diagonal line this way, and then turn on the frame blending for the composition. And now if I preview this back, you'll see it's a little bit smoother, but we sort of have this frame blending business. Now, sometimes this is okay depending on the effect you're looking for, sometimes not really. Now, if we click again on this frame blending, we're going to be using a function called pixel motion. Now, pixel motion is a brand new function in After Effects 7 and CS3 that allows frames to be blended based on their motion. So instead of just blending layers together, it actually analyzes the frame and creates an intermediate frame. So if I toggle through these frames one by one using page up and page down, you'll see that each frame is unique and we don't have that frame blending business. Now if you look right here, you will see some funky warping. And that's sort of a side effect of this effect, but in this case that would have been keyed out. But it's not always perfect, but for the most part you're going to get some really nice slow motion. So let's preview this out. Now sometimes I cut out the RAM previews, but I just want you to see that yes, RAM previews take a long time no matter who you are. It's just something you got to wait for. Okay. So as you can see, this is a lot smoother than just duplicating the frames, and it's not as awkward as the frame blending. So that's one way to do it. Now you can actually do some other type of speed changes in After Effects, and I'm going to go ahead and shut off frame blending so that it's a little quicker, and that is called a speed ramp. A speed ramp meaning you can go really fast and then go really slow all in the same clip, or go really fast, go slow, then go fast again. And to do that, we right click and we choose time, enable time remapping. So we're going to remap time. And this works just like normal keyframes. We set keyframes and we move them around. So what I'm going to do is set a keyframe right here at the beginning, move forward to his jump, set a keyframe, and move forward to right after his jump and set a keyframe. So now we have time from here to here, and we have time from here to here mapped out by these keyframes. Now what I can do is move this keyframe closer to its first keyframe so that now this goes by fast. Now it doesn't look like it, but if I were to play this back, you would see it's actually going by fast. Now from here to here now is separated, and if I separate it even more, we're going to see slow motion. So as you can see, it's really going slow because it's taking a long time to get from this point in time to this point in time. So I'm going to turn on our frame blending, and then I'm going to preview this, and you're going to see what I mean. Okay. This is basically how time remapping works in After Effects. So you can see the possibility of using this technique to kind of simulate that 300 speed ramp where it goes fast and slow back and forth. So be sure to check that out. Hi, welcome to the 3D portion of the After Effects Basic Training Series. In this segment, we're going to take a look at creating 3D layers in After Effects and cameras and lights and all that good stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. What I have is a blank composition, and I'm going to take some of my media here and just stick it into the comp. So I'm just dragging it out. Now, I'm going to also trim the composition and just drag the work area in, right click and choose trim comp to work area. So now we just have these 4 layers and they extend to the length of the composition. Now in After Effects, everything is mostly 2-dimensional. So layers are on top of layers, and that's just kind of the way things stack together. But After Effects also has 3D functionality, which means I can turn these layers into 3D. And to do that, we have a 3D layer switch. So we just click it. For each layer we want to be 3D, and the layers are now 3D. But you're saying, okay, I don't see anything different, except if you select a layer, you see a little gizmo that allows you to adjust the layers in 3D space. So for example, I'm going to solo this layer so that we just see this layer. What I can do is drag the red arrow left and right, and that moves it on the x-axis. Green arrow, y-axis, up and down. And then we have the z-axis, which moves it in z space. So you can move it close or far away. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's the same as just scaling it up. Well, watch this. I'm going to create a new camera. So now this is a 3D camera that comes inside of After Effects, and there's some options here. I'll just leave it at the 50mm preset and choose OK. So now we have a composition camera, and this camera now can see all of the 3D layers. And with a camera in the comp, we can now access this great camera tool. We have the Orbit camera tool, Track XY camera tool, and the Z camera tool. Now the Orbit camera tool allows you to click in the composition and drag around, basically flying around the objects. Now we have the Track camera tool, which allows you to move past stuff. I know it looks like I'm moving the layer, but I'm just moving the camera. And we also have the Z camera tool that allows you to kind of push in close to the layers or pull back far away. Now, what can we do with our 3D layers? Well, let's arrange them in 3D space. So I'm going to scale it down. I'm going to scale them all down just a little bit, and just sort of move them around. Okay, now I can also move these layers forward and back. So I can go to the Z-axis, roll it over until we see the little Z, and push this back. Take this one, we'll move it close, we'll move this one back. You can also hold down Shift and it'll move the layer faster into the distance. So now we have our layers kind of offset in 3D space. And then if we take the Orbit camera tool, we can really start to see that our layers are in fact 3-dimensional. Now we may want to move them a little bit closer together so that we can really fly around them. But as you can see, we do have the control over these layers using the camera. Now we can go to our Track Z camera tool and kind of push in through these layers and make like a video, flyby or something. And if you hit the letter C, it toggles through these tools. This tool allows us to kind of move the camera. This one moves in, this one flies around. Now we also have access to so many more functions now that we're in 3D. For example, right now we have the active camera. Well, we can also change this to some preset views. For example, we go to the top view and see what these layers look like from above. So you can see we can move these around, maybe make them closer together or offset them, a little bit easier from the top view. You can see now our layers are a little bit closer together, and we can, animate this. For example, if we go to the camera, bring down the transform properties, we can keyframe the position of the camera. Go to the beginning here, set the stopwatch for the position, move forward, and then X, Y, Z. Z meaning forward and back, and we can move the Z to a higher value And then if we play this back with the RAM preview, you can see we sort of push through the 3D layers. We can also add easy ease curves to this keyframe. So if we hit F9, if you remember from the animation segment, this will just make the animation a little bit smoother. Now I'm going to set the resolution to 1/4 so that it renders a bit faster, and I'll just hit preview. So there's a pretty simple 3D animation. Now, there's a lot more we can do. For example, I'm going to create a light. So I'm going to choose Layer, New, Light. And here is our light dialog. We can make a spotlight, which is a light that points in a direction. We can make a point light, which is sort of like a light bulb that just illuminates out from the center, and an ambient light, which you don't actually see, but just slightly brightens everything up depending on how bright you make it. Now, I like to use the point light for most things. And there's an option to cast shadows and to change the color of the light. So let's make the light color blue, and we'll turn the cast shadows on. And then I'll choose OK. And so now we've created a light, and that's what the light looks like. And our light can also be moved around in Z space. You can move it forward and back, bring it up high. And we can also change the light properties by choosing Layer, Light Settings. And go back in and say, well, blue is a little intense, and change it as needed. You can also bring down the light options, and you're going to see you can again change the settings. But what about casting shadows? I turn that on, but nothing is happening. Well, layers also have to be told to either receive shadows or to also cast shadows. To access 3D options for any 3D layer, hit AA twice, the letter A twice, and you bring up the material options. You can also just toggle down, and you'll see it right below the transform option. So we have our material option. So cast shadows is off. Well, what if we want that on? Now, more importantly, what if we want that on for several layers? Well, we can do it for each layer. Turn it on, go to this layer, turn it on, etc. But if we select a bunch of layers, hit AA, turn cast shadows on, it turns them on for all of the layers. So let's put this light into a position to cast shadows. So I'm going to bring it forward, and now you can see a shadow is sort of casting right here. And I'm going to shut these layers off for a second. And then we're going to move this layer around, and we'll push it back closer to our other layer. And I'm going to move my camera in a bit, and we're going to orbit around so we can see this. So our light is now casting shadows. So this layer is sending shadows to the background layer. Now we can go into our light options. AA actually brings up material options for any 3D layer. And we can turn the diffusion for the shadow up. And if we're tricky enough, you can see that the shadow now is soft. And that's helpful. We can also bring the darkness of the shadow down if we just want it to be a slight shadow. So as you can see, lights and shadows and 3D layers have a lot of different uses. But let's go ahead and delete the light, go to our camera, reset the camera position, and then go to our two layers and reset their transform position, and reset. And so now everything's back to its default level. And I'm going to scale these layers down a bit. And then I'm going to move one to the right and one sort of to the left. Then I'm going to move one closer to the camera and one further away from the camera. And what I'm going to do is go to the camera settings, bring down the camera options, and turn on the depth of field. Now the depth of field is basically the function that allows you to simulate a real camera lens where you have a focal plane, where something is in focus and something further away or closer to you is out of focus. So we turn this on by clicking, and then if we bring the aperture up, make it larger, you'll see that everything is going out of focus, and that's because our focus distance is probably right in the middle of these two layers. So I'm going to take my focus distance and move it. So you can see we can focus on her, or we can focus on the front layer. Let's see if we can adjust these layers. So if we slide the focus distance, you can see we can kind of move between these two. Now, another part of 3D in After Effects are the 3D aware effects. What I'm going to do is create a new solid. And from the effects presets, I'm going to type in particle. And there's an effect in the simulation category called CC Particle World. I'm going to drag this out to my black solid. And as you can see, it creates this crazy looking 3D fountain. Now, this particular effect has a little 3D box next to it when we have a 3D camera out. And that means that this effect can see 3D. Now, we don't have to turn on the 3D layer switch. In fact, we're not supposed to. This effect is aware of the camera and renders it out accordingly. So if we come in here to our orbit camera tool, we can rotate around and see that this effect is actually 3D. Now you'll notice the layers just don't render in the correct order. And that's simply because After Effects is 2.5D, so it's not quite 3D. It basically works in a way where layers that are on top render on top and layers that are underneath render underneath. So if I were to take this mall video and put it on top, it would then render in the correct order. So you sort of just have to kind of trick After Effects to do what you want it to do if it's not going to do it for you, you know, at the default level. But anyway, there are many effects that are 3D aware, and I just wanted to kind of touch on this possibility of really adding, you know, a new dimension in 3D. Also, some great plugins. I gotta plug these guys because they're just they're great guys. Trapcode.com. They have a plugin called Particular, which is fully 3D and can make some amazing effects. They're also working on a new plugin that should be out by the time you're watching this, but I don't want to say too much about it. Needless to say, check out their plugins. They're really great for After Effects. Welcome to the titling segment of the After Effects Basic Training Series. Alright, this is where we create cool looking text, or we try to. Well, the main thing we're going to take a look at is the text tool. Here it is in its glory. When you click on the text tool, you usually get the character and paragraph options. If not, here's the context box that brings those up. Usually you have a little bit more space to work with, but we'll do our best. What I'm going to do is take the text tool, and I've created a blank composition, and I'm going to click right into the comp, and I'm going to type After Effects. Then I can go back to my arrow tool, and I'll center this up. We can also bring up the title safe, and that way we can kind of find the center. Hide that. Okay, I'm going to make some more room for the character palette. Now, we have our font. The great thing about the font is you can use the up and down arrow keys to cycle through it. And if you use the arrow key and you select the text layer, you can kind of switch through it and you don't have to have the text selected. Now, once you find the font you're looking for, we have a few other options. We have text size, text spacing, tracking, a stroke we can also apply. To add a stroke or an outline to your text, click on this back color, double click, and you can just choose a color, and it'll create a nice stroke there, and you can change the size of it here, how it looks, whether it fills over the stroke, and that way the stroke is kind of behind your text. Let's try another color here. Now in CS3 you'll notice that the color picker updates in the viewport real time, so that's kind of a nice feature right there. Okay, so you can see that a little bit better there. And there's also some other options here to stretch the text, etc. Now below here, you're probably familiar with a lot of these from Photoshop. We have the Fox Bold, Fox Italicized, and Forced Capitalization, and then we have sort of the caps with the staggered size. Now, we also have our paragraph options. So when we play with our tracking, you may notice the tracking happens from the center. when your text is centered. Now, if it's aligned to the left, the tracking will kind of go out in that direction. So just be aware that you may want to change your paragraph options depending on what you're after. Now, After Effects comes with a lot of text presets. So what are text presets? Well, let's go to our Effects and Presets tab, and then we'll go down the Animation Presets, scroll down, Text, and then we can scroll that down, and there's a whole bunch of presets, like probably, let me see, I counted them the other day, there's like 80 billion. And what you can do is kind of go through it, pick one that you like, drag it out right onto your text, either in the composition or in the timeline, and wherever your current time indicator is, that's where the animation begins. Well, if you remember from an earlier tutorial, if you hit the letter U with the layer selected, you'll bring up all the keyframes for that animation. Then, if you hit U twice, you'll bring up all the animated properties, or all of the changed properties. And you'll see a whole bunch of stuff in here, and you can edit this, but the main thing is these offset keyframes. So I'm just going to hit U once. So now I have the 2 keyframes for my offset. So this animation kind of animates out. And that's what this animation does. But I can simply take the first keyframe, drag it to the other side, and now I have an animate in. And I can drag both of these keyframes to the beginning, and so I can start my animation whenever I like. Now, if you don't like the animation, just hit undo, and you can remove it. Now, you can also go to this little arrow, and you're probably not going to be able to see it, but if you go down to Browse Presets, which is about halfway down, it'll bring up Adobe Bridge, and you can then go into the presets for the animations of the text, double click, and then you can see all of the folders, and we can go to the organic ones. And what's nice is if you click on any one of these, you'll see a little animation up in the top here that'll kind of show you what that does. And I think if you're crafty enough, if you double click on it, it applies it to your actual layer. So then we can go to our time controls, hit the RAM preview button. Now if anyone uses this preset, I will lose it. So anyway, that's kind of the basics of the text tool and the animation presets. Well, After Effects is capable of a lot more, and we're going to go ahead and see what we can create using After Effects built-in tools. So I'm going to create a new blank composition using these settings, 10 seconds long, and choose OK. So now I have a blank composition. What I have also in my project window is our After Effects basic training star. I'm going to drag that out into the comp window. So this is just a star flattened in Photoshop without a black background. So the transparency is built in. Now I'm going to take the text tool, click in the comp area, and I'm going to type After Effects. Now it sort of kept my effects from my previous text. Well, I'm going to go to my character palette, and I'm going to get rid of the stroke by clicking on this Get Rid of button here. And now I have just my text, and what I'll do is with that layer selected, I'll go ahead and scale it down a little bit. Then I'm going to select the layer and duplicate it. So I can choose Edit, Duplicate. I can also hit Control D, so pay attention to those shortcuts. So now there's 2 copies. Now I'm going to go ahead and scale this second copy up a little bit, and I'm going to type Basic Training. Now I do have the all caps button checked. I'm going to go and move these down a bit. Okay, so if I position these accordingly, I get sort of my logo from the basic training series. Now, all these layers can be animated together I could parent them together. For example, I could parent the text to the star, and then if I rotate the star layer, they'll all follow. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to pre-compose these layers. And what that means is basically nest them into a separate composition so that they all show up as one single layer. Let me show you. So I'm going to select the first layer, hold down Shift, and select the last layer. Then I'm going to choose Layer, Pre-Compose. And then it's going to say Move All Attributes to New Comp, and we'll call this logo and choose OK. So as you can see, all of these layers are now represented by this one layer that I can now move around. Now, if I want to get back inside and edit this or change the color or do whatever, Alt, double click on it, or just double click on this pre-comp in the project window. A new comp window and timeline pops up, and I can then edit it here. But for now, I'll go ahead and close that. So back to my main comp 2. What I have created now is my logo. And now I want to create a background. So I'm going to choose Layer, New, Solid. And we're going to make a black solid background. So I'm just going to select black, choose OK, and make comp size, choose OK. And I'll take my black solid, move it to the background. Then I'm going to add a gradient to the background. I'm going to choose Effect, Generate, Ramp. Then I'm going to change the ramp shape to Radial Ramp. Then with the ramp name selected, I'm going to move this into the center. And this point maybe just right here. Now, I have 2 colors to choose from for this radial gradient ramp. Radial gradient ramp. Wow, great. And I'm going to set the internal color to a dark green, and I'm going to set the end color to black. So I've created just sort of a nice gradient. Okay, that looks pretty good, but what if we wanted to add some 3D to our title? Well, we can take our logo comp and turn on the 3D layer switch. So now the layer's 3D. I can go to my rotation tool and rotate this in 3D space now. I don't want to yet, but I can. Now I'm going to create a new 3D camera. So I'm going to choose Layer, New, Camera. And I'm going to use the 50mm preset. The 50 and 35 are usually good places to start. Then I'm going to choose OK. And nothing changes, but now I have a camera. And what the camera allows me to do is use these tools to fly around the scene. So if I take the Orbit camera tool, I can click in the comp area and drag kind of in a circle and kind of fly around my text. So far, so good. Now I'm going to create another new solid. So Layer, New, Solid. And make comp size and choose OK. Then to this solid, I'm going to apply a 3D particle system. So I'm going to go to my effects and presets. I'm going to type in particle, and particle world comes up, and that's the one we want. So I'm going to drag that out to my new solid. Now I'm going to rename this solid by hitting return on the main keyboard, and we're going to call it particles. Now I'm going to take a moment and give you kind of a brief overview of a particle system. So I'm going to solo the layer. Now a particle system is basically a system that generates, particles, raindrops, snow, any kind of system that requires a lot of instances of something similar or, something that needs to interact together. So in this case, here's our particle system. It's like a huge fountain of golden lines. So not particularly useful yet, but it has potential. So I'm going to come over here to my effects controls. And if you're in 6.5, F3 brings that up. And for our grid, I'm going to set the floor to off. Let's go ahead and go through the settings. Now we have scrubbers. This is basically a way to navigate the particle system. No thank you. I'm going to go ahead and shut that off. Now we have birth rate. How many particles are born per second? Now these numbers are obscure. They don't really mean anything, but we can increase it and decrease it. Now next is longevity. So how long do the particles last? How long do they live? Is another way to think about it. You can extend that. I think this is seconds, but it may just be an obscure number. Now next we have the producer. So producer can also be called emitter depending on the particle system you're working with. And basically this is the cannon, or what exactly is shooting out these particles. You can change the position, X, Y, Z there. You can also change the radius. In this case, it's a box. So if I were to increase the X, it would stretch it. The Y, stretch it up. And the Z, stretch it long ways. So kind of create this big box of particles. And that's actually what I want to do. But you can just make it a single point, you know, fly it around, do some Harry Potter stuff. I know you're dying to do that. Now, next we have physics. So that's gravity, velocity, resistance, thermodynamics, all that good stuff. Basically, we can change a few of these options. So we have explosive. So that's kind of the particles are shooting out from a single source. So if we were to kind of scrub through this, you kind of see they're kind of flying outward. There's also an option, you know, twirl. It kind of flies around crazily. And now we have the velocity. That's the speed of the particles. You set this to 0, and the particles will essentially stand still except for our gravity here. Now, you could use this to create a nice looking rain if you change the color. So there are possibilities with this one effect. Now, the gravity, if you set that to 0, the particles will stay still. Now, in this case, they're disappearing because the particle type, which is in the next segment, is based on particles that are actually moving. So a still particle does not exist. But we'll turn the gravity back on just so we can see them. I'm going to open up the particle type, and we can change that to any of these different things. Now, some of them make sense, a cube. Some of them don't. Some of them are useless, but you know, use what you can. There's a star one here. There's your Harry Potter. I like to use the lens convex. Now, the lens convex is a bit limited, but I just like what it does. And the reason it's limited is because I can't change the color of the particle. What I have to do is change the layer color. So what I do is select the layer, choose layer solid settings, and I'll change this to like a light green and choose OK. So now my particles will render, and you can see they're kind of falling. Now I'm going to shut the gravity off again and shut that to 0. And so only thing that's happening is the particles are being born and they're dying. So you kind of see they pop up and they disappear. So they're being born, they disappear. Now, in the particle type, we can change the texture. So if we were to use a textured disk, and we can use another layer as the reference for that particle. So maybe we had little smiley faces or something. I don't know why we would do that, but suppose we did. You could change the texture, and in more advanced particle systems like Particular by Trapcode, you can actually have animated layers and do a lot of things in 3D with the particles. This system, very limited, but you know, you stretch out the possibilities so that you can actually use it. But I digress. Birth size. How big are they when they're born? You know, death size. How small are they when they die? Usually have more options than this, but you know, like I said, this one's a bit limited. Just kind of read what it says and should make sense. And if all else fails, you know, don't feel scared to just play with that slider and see what it does. So in this case, here's the particles, and we can change some colors if we were using a different particle type. But for now, that's kind of the gist of it. And the camera, usually don't have a lot of options here, especially we want to use the comp camera. So see this little 3D box? That means this particle system will work in 3D space. So if I turn off the solo layer thing, go up here to my orbit camera tool, I can click and drag and check it out. 3D. That's an amazing thing there. Now let's dress this up a little bit better here. I'm going to go back into my particle type for my particle world effect, and I'm going to shrink these particles down. I don't want them so large. And then I'm going to add a glow to our particles. And to do that, take my arrow tool and we're going to choose Effect, Stylize, and Glow. So default kind of adds a soft glow, but I want to increase that intensity, and then I want to bring the threshold down. And the threshold, the higher the threshold or the brighter the pixel has to be in order for it to glow. So if you bring the threshold down, even the less bright pixels will actually emit and glow. And I can also change the glow to be based on the alpha channel, meaning glow around the outside or around the transparency of a layer. And sometimes this works a little bit better. Now, the composite original means, what do I do with what it looked like before? Here's what it looked like before. Well, I want to composite the original on top. And that way the glow kind of comes from behind the particle or the layer, depending on what you're working on. Now we go down here, the glow colors is set to AB colors, which is right here. That basically means you get to pick the color. So I'm going to change color B to green. And you can see now we have a nice glow. I'm going to actually turn the intensity down a bit now that we have this set up using the alpha channel. And maybe turn the threshold up a bit too. Okay, now here's our particles. Now they're rendering, a few anyway, are rendering over our text. Well, I'm going to move this below our logo. And then I'm going to take our logo and I'm going to Alt double click on it. I want to add a drop shadow to our text so that it stands out a little bit better. So Alt double click on the logo. And we can show the transparency. Select basic training, choose effect, perspective, drop shadow. And pretty common settings here. Distance, how far. I'm going to set the distance to 0, the opacity of the shadow to 100. Can't see it because it's right behind it. And then softness up. Now if I want to make it darker, I can just choose Edit, Duplicate with this drop shadow selected. And when I do that, let's make 2 copies of the shadow. And that way it's just a little bit darker. Then what I'll do is hold down Shift and select both of these. Choose Edit, Copy. Select After Effects, the top layer, and choose Edit, Paste. So bam, all the same effects. We're set to go. I'll go ahead and close this, and now we're returning to our main comp, and we're looking pretty good here. Now, it's time to animate. Well, we can take the Orbit camera tool and fly around our text, do some different stuff, but I want to kind of show you a better way to use the After Effects camera, because it can be a bit tricky when you start doing more complicated compositions. Complicated compositing and compositions while you're composing music for company. Anyway, what you want to do is create a null object. So I'm going to choose Layer, New, Null Object. Now we talked about null objects previously, but I'm going to kind of go over it again. I'm going to choose Null Object, and it's kind of created there. It starts out as a 2D object, but we want to click on the 3D checkbox. Also, for any of the switches, you can just click on one and just drag down, and it turns them all on for other layers. Or if you have a few layers selected and you turn it on for one, it turns it on for all of those ones. So any of the switches will allow you to do that. It's kind of nice. But now that our null object is 3D, what I'm going to do is take the camera, take the parent whip, and parent our null object. Okay, what have I done? I've basically taken this camera, and instead of having to animate the anchor point, like where the camera is looking and the camera, and trying to make this all work, I've now created a null object that I can animate all by itself, and I don't have to worry about any of the complexities of this camera for right now. So what I can do is simply animate the position of the null object. So if I hit P, I can kind of move these values around, and you see the null object doesn't really move. Well, it does, but the camera is linked to the null object, and since we're looking through the camera, whatever I do moves the camera, and so the null object always seems to stay right in front of it. It's like being on a wagon and the wagon's pulling you around. You're always going to see, the handle of the wagon. It's just pulling you around and, pushing you down and taking your lunch money. So these are sad times. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to move the current time indicator to the beginning of the comp. Uh-oh, our particles have disappeared. Well, they haven't disappeared, it's just they haven't been born yet. So if I take my particle layer, I can offset it, and so that it's already been emitting particles for a few seconds, and that way they'll be there the entire time. Now, in After Effects CS3, the nice thing is you can just extend layers on infinitely. Otherwise, you may just have to make your comp longer in order for the layers to be longer if you're working in an earlier version, but you'll figure it out. So here we are, and our particles are up, and we want to animate this null object. So I'm going to set the stopwatch for the position. Remember, the position, letter P. Set the stopwatch. Move forward. Then I'm going to set a keyframe for the position. Then I'm going to click this back arrow, which takes me back to the other keyframe here. And I'm just going to, I don't know, X, Y, Z. I'm going to move us over a bit. So now, you kind of see we kind of fly through this. Now, here's the thing. I want to have particles all over the place, and I don't see any particles over here. So I want to make our particle field larger. So if I go back to my particle layer, bring down my particle world, I bring up my producer or my emitter, and I have my radius X, Y, Z. I want to make it bigger, taller, and longer. Now you spread it out, what do? Well, you make it seem like there's less particles. So we also want to increase the birth rate. So more babies. We'll even make this wider. Now I'm also going to increase the longevity of the particles so they kind of stay up a little bit longer. They seem to be kind of turning on and off a little too much. And if you turn that up, you also want to turn the birth rate down to kind of even it out. So now if we look at our animation, looks pretty cool. Looks like we're really in 3D space. Now, the animation is going to be a little choppy, but let's check it out. I'm going to hit play forward, RAM preview. So really choppy. So I'm going to select this keyframe and hit F9. And if you remember, that's sort of the easy ease keyframe that's going to kind of smooth and slowly stop into that position. Then animate it. Okay, looking pretty good. Now, what if we want to do some more cool stuff like fly past this and, I don't know, do something else? Well, no problem. What I'm going to do is take our logo, take the pan behind tool, because what I want to do is I want to take the rotation tool and rotate our layer, but I want to rotate around our star. So if I go to the pan behind tool, kind of move in here, I can move this pivot point right to the middle of this star. So now if I take the rotation tool, I can rotate around the Z-axis, and you can see it's kind of rotating in a circle around the star, and that's what we want to do. So now we fly in, we'll pause for a moment, then we'll go to the logo, hit R, brings up the rotation, and when a layer is 3D, it's called orientation. So we'll set the orientation, move forward a little bit, X, Y, Z. So I want to move the Z up, maybe 90 degrees. And it's good to work in numbers like that, 90, 270, 45, 180, and animate that forward. Also select both of the keyframes here and hit F9. So it's kind of a nice smooth animation. Then I'll set a keyframe for my null object's position. Remember, the null object is pulling the camera around. Then I'll move forward a bit, and X, Y, Z of my null object, I'm going to move the Z space forward. Maybe about right there. So we animate, we see our title, it spins down, and we fly past it. Kind of like some space gate for After Effects. Okay, now we fly past it to what though? An empty field. So let's create another text layer out in the distance. Now, I can create another text layer, or I can be lazy, go into my logo comp, Alt, double click, copy this After Effects text, Control C or Edit, copy, go back to Comp 2, Edit, paste, and then turn on the 3D layer switch. Let's move it up so we can see it. There it is, looking good. We'll move it to the top of the stack so we can see it. And remember, 3D layers don't really matter too much, the order they're rendering, as long as they're all next to other 3D layers. But you'll figure that out along the way. Now, if I zoom in here, we have our X, Y, Z axis. I'm going to roll over the Z axis, And I'm going to push this back. Now, it's kind of going slow as I'm moving it. Now, if I hold down Shift, it moves at a value of times 10, so it goes a lot faster. Now, I pushed it back there, and I'll move it up too just so we can see it. And it's way back there. Then if I move forward on my animation, you can see we kind of close in on it. Then I can reposition it so that it's squared up with the camera. So turn on my title safe here, and we'll bring it close to the camera here. Well, not close, but a normal size. And then we'll move it here. Shut off our title safe. And now we can kind of watch the animation. So here it is, and then there's our After Effects text. But the problem is our text is back there and we can see it doesn't quite look right. So what we'll do is during this transition, if I select the null object and hit the letter U, we can look at our keyframes. And the keyframes are kind of the key, like that, keyframes are the key to creating good animation. So for the After Effects layer, I want the opacity to fade in as the camera moves forward. So I'm going to hit the letter T, bring up the opacity, set a keyframe at 0%. Then I'm going to move forward to right when the camera stops and turn the opacity up to 100. So now I'm hitting negative and plus on the keyboard there to move in. Oh, I don't know if I talked about this, but if you haven't figured it out already, layers can be kind of clipped or trimmed by just clicking and dragging the in and out points. And you can kind of move them around, do all that stuff. So I don't know if I talked about that, but focus here. Here's our After Effects layer, and it now fades in as the camera moves on. So let's preview this. Now, let's add some motion blur, but there is one slight problem. The particle generator doesn't generate real looking motion blur. So After Effects has sort of a solution, and I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. And remember, an adjustment layer is a layer you add effects to that affect the layers beneath it. For example, if I were to choose Effect, Color Correction, Hue and Saturation, I could desaturate the entire composition with this one effect, or add saturation or brighten it or whatever. But I don't want to do that. Instead, I'm going to go to my effects and preset, type in Force Motion Blur. Here it is. I'm going to drag it out onto my adjustment layer. And it's already set up with some good settings. Now, if we look at this during a fast moment, you'll see we are sort of rendering out motion blur. Now we can turn the shutter angle up, or the motion blur amount, and that'll kind of streak it even longer. But it starts breaking up a bit, and you may want to increase the samples. See, the blur samples. 16 is pretty good, but remember, the more samples, the longer it's going to take to render. But we'll caution to the wind on this one. So it kind of flies in. Now, the cool part is when it's going to kind of zoom past. See, that looks really good when we kind of fly past all of the layers, kind of have sort of a space warp effect. And you can also add more particles. Now, these particles are a little dead, and I'm going to shut the blur off of the adjustment layer while we work, because it does take some time to render. Now, we can add a little life to our particles. So with that particle layer selected, I can go into the physics, change the animation to maybe like a vortex, and turn the velocity up just a little bit. And that way they just sort of move around a bit, maybe even less than that, 0.02. And that way they just have a little bit of life while you're kind of static. Trying to wrap this up, but I just want to keep showing you cool things. So one more cool thing, just don't stay up too late watching these. Now here's our null object. And we've animated to this After Effects title. So now we have one more title and we're done, right? So I'm going to move forward because we want our title to be up for a moment. Set another keyframe for the position. And then I'm also going to set a keyframe for the orientation at this point in time. So that, let me shut off our motion blur again so that we're not taxed here. So it flies in. We go to the next title. It pauses for a moment. And then we want it to do something else. Now, we could fly past it again or do something else, but what if we change the orientation of the null object? Rotated the world, flew around the world like this, or any other number of ways. Now, our title is not the center of what the camera is looking at. As you can see, the null object is. But what if we can move our title to be right where the null object is so that our camera was flying around it specifically? Well, After Effects has a lot of tools for looking at things in 3D. And if we go here to the active camera and we go to the top view, it's going to look kind of like a bird's eye view down on our layers. There's our particles, and if you select layers, you can kind of see where they're at. Here's our logo right here, and here's our camera, and here's our After Effects text layer. So remember the second title. It's way up here. It's way up north. And if I go in here, I can see where my null object is too. Here's my null object. After Effects title, null object. So how can I sync those together? Well, what I can do is take the After Effects layer, which is right here, and move it in line with the null object. And to do that, I just go to the Z-axis here, roll over, and just push it until it lines up. You can also roll the mouse button to zoom in to really refine it, or use your up and down arrow keys to get it just right. So now I've lined it up, but now it's going to be further in space and probably a little bit smaller. So now if I go back to our active camera, now I can see that my After Effects text is a little bit smaller than before. So instead of even worrying about moving it, I'm just going to scale it up and then reposition it. So now we're basically where we left off. Everything should still animate the same. Except now our camera pivot point, or in this case our null object, remember our wagon that's pulling the camera around and rotating it, our null object can now be rotated to fly around. So what I can do, I can do a lot of things. I can fly upward and have another title waiting for me up here, spin around, and even move around. So what I'll do is I'll hit U on the keyboard, and we'll go to the end of our animation. So it animates to our After Effects title. It holds for a moment. We set our keyframe for the position and the orientation, or the rotation. And I'm going to just move forward a little bit. So what can we do? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to rotate on the Y-axis. And I hold down Shift and it'll snap to that rotation. And I'm going to select these two keyframes, hit F9, so that we have a nice smooth animation. And now we've sort of stopped here. And then I can shut this After Effects layer off so that we don't see it. And I can do that by selecting the layer and hitting Alt in bracket, or just dragging it in and holding down Shift, and it'll snap to the CTI, or the current time indicator. Okay, so now we need another title to be here. So let's duplicate the After Effects title. And now we'll take our After Effects title, take the rotation tool, and rotate it this way. So now it's facing the camera. We'll move it into position. So if we look at the animation, look what's happening. We go from one title to the next title. Now the trick is going to be animating this in a way that looks good. So first thing, we'll make our second After Effects layer longer and then the beginning of it shorter so that it overlaps less. And let's figure out what we can do. So right here is about when we should start seeing it. So I'm going to trim it to right there so that before you don't see it, and then once it starts coming around, that's when you start seeing it. Now we also want to fade out the first layer. So I'll hit T, set a keyframe for the opacity, move forward, fade it out. And now we have our new layer, and then we can double click on it and change it to now in 3D. It's always been, but oh well. So that it kind of comes into play here. Now our layer isn't quite lined up, so let's go and line it up, and let's make sure that our animation looks okay. I mean, obviously your imagination is what's limiting this effect. If you want to do anything, you can. It's just a matter of putting the layers into the proper position and, making sure the null object, rotates around a specific point in order to do that. But obviously, with this 3D engine, there's a lot of possibilities. Now, what is this tutorial on? Are we talking about titling or are we talking about 3D? I don't remember. But I'm glad we got a lot of the 3D stuff in. I know a lot of people are curious about it, and I didn't mean to throw this all at you at the intermediate level, although I suspect there's some people out there watching this that know a few things about After Effects. But that's okay, because I try to mix it up and put some good tips in there for everybody. In fact, you guys want to know a really good tip right now? Right now? Let me think of one. I got nothing. Okay, let's check it out. All right, this tutorial took way longer than I wanted it to, but hey, I hope you guys found some useful tips. Let me go down to my list, make sure I covered everything. We're good to go. Hey, welcome to the expressions portion of the After Effects basic training series. What we're going to be covering in this tutorial is molecular dynamics, thermal energy mechanisms, and possibly some photon scattering quadratic paranormal anomalies. Okay, that didn't really make any sense. I apologize. What we're really going to be doing is taking a look at expressions, which is the scripting language in After Effects. Now, I'm going to try to show you some practical examples, but expressions can be endless. There's so many different variables involved in expressions that I just want to kind of touch on it and kind of show you what it's all about. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to take this footage of Tino, drag it out to the composition area, create a new composition. Now, I'm going to add one of my favorite expressions to this clip. And to do that, we're going to toggle down to the transform property of the position. Now, to add an expression to a value, what you're going to do is Alt-click onto the stopwatch for most any parameter. This brings up this little input box where you can type a message. It also has a default value in most cases, and there's also some other buttons here that we'll get into in a bit. Now, transform.position, that basically is referring to itself. It's saying use the value of itself. So that's the default, but we are going to delete that. So I'm going to hit backspace and we're going to type an expression. Now, there's a bunch of expressions out there. A lot of them you can find inside of here, but they may not make sense exactly. But the truth is, you may not understand exactly what they're referring to. You want to research that once you get into it a little bit more. Now, I happen to know an expression by heart, which I think you should probably memorize also. And here it is. Wiggle, type the word wiggle, lowercase, begin parentheses, we'll type the number 12, a comma, and the value 25, end parentheses. This is an expression. What this is saying is, instead of using this exact value for the position, I want you to wiggle the position or shake the position 12 times a second for a value of 25 units, so 25 pixels in this case. Now, you don't have to really worry about how this is all set up. Just if you type it exactly this way, all you have to know is that the first number is how many times per second, and the second number is how much. So we can change this to 1, so it'll move 1 time a second, 25 pixels, or we can change this to 10, so it'll move 10 times a second, and that's a lot of shaking for 25 pixels. Now, to execute this or close the expression, just click outside the box, and now that expression is working, and the red numbers mean there's an expression applied to this parameter. Now, let's go ahead and preview this. So I'm going to hit the preview button here. So, as you can see, the footage is kind of shaking, okay? Looks pretty good. I can now change this just by clicking inside of the box, and I can type something else, say 25 and 50. Now this is going to be crazy. I'm going to hit play again. A lot of shaking there. Now we can also do something like this. 0.25 and the number 250. Play that back. And so now we have more of a smooth motion. And the wiggle parameter is kind of just a random generator. So this is one of my favorite expressions, and you can see there are a lot of uses for it. Here is the problem. When I set this, that's it. I set it to 5 and 25, and my clip is going to shake the entire time. But what if I don't want that to happen? What if I want it to be static, and then when he falls on the ground, then have it shake? Well, to do that is going to require a little bit more work, but it's pretty easy. With the layer selected, I'm going to choose Effect, Expression Controls, Slider Control. Now, the slider control is just a controller. It doesn't actually affect anything in your footage, but it does have a slider control that allows you to change the value. So, what we're going to do is try to integrate the slider control with our expression. So, right now the expression says 5 times a second, wiggle 25 pixels. Now, what we're going to do is delete the 25 and set our cursor right after the comma. Now, what we can do is click and drag the pick whip to a parameter. For example, if we link this to the slider control, it types in some code automatically. Now, we can type it in ourselves, effect, slider control, but it gets a little tricky and you may not put all the commas in the right place. So, if you use the pick whip, the expression automatically writes itself for the value you're linking. So in this case, the slider value. So now, instead of the value 25, what we have now is a reference to the effect, slider control, slider value. In other words, this value is now being in place of the 25. Now, right now the value is set to 0, so if I click outside, nothing is going to happen to our footage because 5 times a second, it's going to wiggle 0. So what we want to do is change this value to 25. And now, 5 times a second, it's going to wiggle 25 times. So now if we look at the footage, we're back to where we started from. The only difference is we have a slider control that we can now keyframe and animate. So I'll set the value to 0. And then I'll click on the stopwatch. That sets a keyframe at 0. Then, if I select the layer, hold down Shift and the letter U, I'll bring that slider control keyframe up, and then I can line this up with his fall, move that first keyframe right there, go a couple of frames after that, and turn the slider control up to, 100 or so, 75. So now, the footage is still, when he falls down, it starts shaking. We can then turn it down to 0 so that it starts shaking and then it slowly stops. Now, let's go ahead and preview this. So I'll hit the play forward. So we've created a nice camera shake effect using our great little expression. Now, we do get a little bit of black around the edges, so what we can do is scale up the layer a little bit, and that way we don't see that. Also, for some more advanced tips on this effect, check out videocopilot.net. There's a good tutorial on creating an earthquake effect. So here is an expression that we've hooked up to a slider control. Now, some other ways to use expressions include alt-clicking on other parameters. So I'm going to alt-click on our opacity. And instead of typing anything, I'm going to take the pick whip and I'm going to link it to the slider control. So it types in the necessary script, I click away, and what this is doing is directly linking the opacity with the slider control. So all that means is whatever the slider is, whatever we keyframe this value to be, the opacity is going to do exactly the same thing. Now what's great about that is we can animate one parameter and link other parameters to that one parameter, and so if we want to make a change, we can change the one parameter and it updates for all of the other parameters. For example, now that these two values are linked, if I scrub through the animation, you see we've keyframed the slider up to 73 and you can see the value changes. Now if you look at the opacity, it also changes together. Now in this case, this isn't something we'd want to do. We wouldn't want the opacity to just kind of come in and fade out. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that expression. So I'm going to alt click on this stopwatch and that removes the expression. You can also click on this equal sign and that kind of puts a cross, meaning don't use the expression. But we'll go ahead and turn that back on. Now what we're going to do is add an expression to the rotation value. But guess what? Our expression is already written. I'm going to use the same expression that I have on the position. So I'm going to select what I've typed, right click and choose copy. So I just copied this text. Then I'm going to alt click on the rotation, delete what's here, right click and choose paste. And so now I've copied my wiggle expression right into the rotation value. And remember, the wiggle is wiggling 5 times a second and whatever this slider control says. So watch what happens. It goes along, the camera starts to shake, and it also starts to rotate. But that's a lot of rotation. That cameraman is getting hurt. So we want to decrease that amount. But I've already set this slider control up. I don't want to bring the slider value down, because if I do that, my wiggle for the position isn't going to be as much, so we're not going to be able to see the camera shake. So how can I change this rotation value without having to create a whole bunch of expressions for it? So what we can do instead is add a simple math equation to the end of the rotation, and I say equation loosely. What I'm going to type is divide, so the divide sign, right after this value, divide by 10. So whatever this value creates, divided by 10. So if it's 25, it'll be 2.5, and so on. So then I'm going to click away, and now our rotation value, if you look here, is, maximum goes up to -1 or so. Now, if you want more, we'll just divide by 5. So now we have a little bit of rotation, as you can see in the project window. And say you want a little bit more, just make this number less, divide by 2. And so now we have a little bit of rotation. I think, let's go divided by 3. So we have a little bit of rotation along with our shake. Let's go ahead and preview that. Not too bad. Now, say I want the rotation to happen faster than the position offset. Well, our wiggle expression says 5 times a second, wiggle this value divided by 3, essentially. Well, how about we change that to 12 times a second? So a lot more shaking. Same amount of shaking, just a lot more of it. Change it to 12, and I'm going to click away. Now let's preview this. So now the rotation is a little bit quicker, but instead, I'm going to reverse that. I'm going to set this back to 5, and then for my position, I'm going to set the number 5 to 12. So 12 times a second, it's going to offset itself, and it'll be a little bit quicker on the shake side. I'm going to go ahead and hit preview. Okay, so now we've created some cool shake, and we have it keyframed, and if I want to change this value, say I want to increase it, it's 25 right now at the high point. So we set that up to like 60. Preview it again. you can see the rotation is a lot stronger, and it's because all the expression is all linked in together. Now, isn't that amazing? Okay, well, you can't impress everybody. Now, like I said, there's a lot of expressions out there that you should go investigate and do some research on. But the bottom line is when you hear expressions or scripting in After Effects, I don't want you to worry and I don't want you to get scared, because you can handle it. And in any of the tutorials at videocopilot.net, anytime I introduce you to a new expression, I'll usually explain it pretty well. Now, another thing I want to point out is right here we're dividing by 3, but we can do other things like multiply times 2. So if you'd rather multiply, you can do that as well. Now, multiplying that rotation is going to be pretty drastic, but the bottom line is you can add simple little math equations and drive powerful effects. Anyway, that's in a nutshell expressions inside of After Effects. I hope you look into it, and I hope you start using them every single day, because they will save you some time. And thanks for watching. Okay, welcome to the rendering segment of the After Effects Basic Training Series. So you're all done, you made your video, you made your titles, and you're ready to render it out to import into your project, your editing program, or wherever you want to burn it to a DVD or a CD. You're all done. How do you render it out? How do you get it out of After Effects? Well, here's your composition. It's all done. What you do is you choose Composition, Add to Render Queue. The render queue is the key. Now, I'll show you one other cool thing with the user interface. If you hold down Control, you can drag panels and make them float. And that way they don't all have to be kind of stuck together. We've now added this composition to the render queue. And we have our settings, output module, and our output to. Output to, meaning where do we want to save it to? And what do we want to save it as? Our render settings, usually best is the way to go. And then our output module. Output module is the most important part here. This is where we tell it what settings to use. Now, there's a million settings. There's AVIs and QuickTime and all these different formats. Well, I'm going to tell you today that the easiest one to use is QuickTime. Now, you're going to come across specialized codecs, and you're going to come across reasons why other codecs might be better for certain situations. But for the most part, QuickTime is a real easy, real good way to render your video. So I'm going to choose my output module, click on the lossless, then we get our settings here. We're going to change our format to QuickTime, and then we get our options to choose what QuickTime settings we want to use. Now, there's 2 in here that I kind of recommend. Animation, if you have the hard disk space, animation is great, but it's uncompressed and the files are huge. If file size is going to be a problem, Photo JPEG is a really high quality codec that has pretty reasonable file sizes. And you can also bring this percent down, and if you hold down Alt, you can kind of go to about 95. And if I choose OK, I now have set it to Photo JPEG. I can also output audio or not. Usually I don't work with audio in After Effects, but you can if you would like. You can stretch and crop the output based on all these settings. Then I choose OK. Tell it where I want to save it, and I'm going to call this, mall.mov. Then I click Save, and then I click Render. It's going to render the footage out, and when it's done, it's going to chime. You can take that file, import it into your video editor, and you're all set. Of course, in the output module, you can do a few other things. You can change the format. You can set it to render for a DVD. You can render to an FLV, which is helpful. In After Effects 7, to render to an FLV, which is a flash layer video, choose Effect, Export FLV. Now, I recommend not ever using the export function for movies. It's really just not a really good way to export out of After Effects, and I know it's probably the most commonly used way, but in After Effects, use the render queue, better quality and easier to manage. You can find files. For example, if I go to Window, bring the render queue back up, say I'm looking for the file, I can toggle the output module and it's going to tell me right where that file is. And then I can click on that, in fact, and it actually brings the folder up where that file is located. It also gives you some settings, Now, when you render files out, in the project window, we have 8 bits per channel. Now, sometimes color banding will occur and you want to render out 16 bits per channel. So if you hold down Alt, click on this, and you'll see 16. Now, 32 bits, until you know what 32 bits per channel is, don't use it. But just, look into it. But for the most part, you won't need to use that unless you're doing, feature film, high-end compositing. So 8 bits, 16 bits is the way to go. For now, that's the end of the After Effects Basic Training Series. And I encourage you to watch the tutorials, but to think of ways you can use those effects and those techniques for completely different things. So remember, always be thinking of creative possibilities, and you will go far with this program. I got nothing else to say. I am tired. I've been doing this for hours. What is wrong with me? I don't know. Anyway, enjoy yourself, and now you can start writing After Effects on your resumes and your job applications. I will vouch for you. If you go through this basic training, I say, look, I know that guy. He's a good guy, and I recommend him to all the employers out there.